Yes, we have the entity in those relations with the universe and universal forces, as are latent and exhibited in the present entity. In entering, we find the entity coming under influences that, astrologically speaking, would not be in the manner of exact, for the will with its application has changed much in the innate influences in this entity's experience. Hence we find many of those elements that are to others entirely satisfactory, to their way of thinking or feeling, not satisfactory at all to this entity, for the entity must experience itself that which becomes true, or applicable, or usable, for the entity's experience. Not, then, that the entity is so self-willed as to be termed hard-headed, yet some would term the body that. But in entering we find these influences entering astrologically, under the influence, then of Venus, Jupiter, Mercury and Uranus. Love, then, being for the entity a motive power, it must be tempered with ennobling influences and reason. Neither being wholly satisfactory without the other two. Ennobling, beautiful, lovable, yet reasonable. In the experiences, then, we find the will's application, even in the present experience, bringing changes in the life, and the application of physical, material and spiritual truths. 1. Then, loving the beautiful, is the beautiful, tempered with material, spiritual or physical worth. One that gives much in the experiences of life by the radiation of that experienced. One that gives the impressions of that felt from within, abhorring and hating that is untrue, yet able, capable, to live that as is felt to be the ennobling principle, even though not an experience of self. This contradictory in an aspect, yet the entity has so tuned itself to enable itself to ever, mentally and physically, act that as is felt to be the proper mode of action. Yet when certain or any element enters that the entity feels would induce or tend to make another misunderstand, or misconstrue self, the entity chooses ever that which is the better part towards the beautiful and ennobling side of mental force. And the applications of self as respecting that shown forth in the entity's individuality and personality, we find, while the entity may, and does at times make many friends, few feel they wholly understand the entity's actions, and yet none ever question the acts of the entity. 1. Then, that acts as the entity, would have others act toward them. A living ensample, then, of that rule. Not that remorse, discontent nor sorrow never enters, but that those are made stepping stones for the better understanding of the mental and spiritual life. The individuality of the entity is reflected more than ordinarily in the personality of the entity. One that a greater fault may be termed as able to hold grudges. Not in the sense of petty grudges, but just the act as if the body or individual doesn't exist, and this often brings that in the experience that makes for the sigh and for the misunderstanding of others' position in the entity's experience. In the experiences in the earth's plane there may be seen the reflection of those conditions in the mental and physical body that attend it, in part innate influences, and the experiences of the mental abilities of the entity. In the experience, then, before this, we find in that period of the first settlers of this particular land in which the entity now resides. The entity then among those who were carried by Bridge, in the entering of the land, to the southern clime, as the new settlers at what is now known as the pleasure resort of the south. Hence the beauties of outdoor, the harmonies of the actions in nature, are ever to the entity as lessons for life's own experience. Then in the name of Victoria Abel, the entity gained in that experience, and in the giving of self to the peoples in aiding the sick, the suffering, the entity gained much of the glimpse of experiences gained in the previous experience. The influences in the present experience, that of the love of nature, yet the home builder, the aid to the weak and oppressed. The entity ever takes sides with those that are oppressed, while not loud in speech, yet in action exhibits much. In the one before this we find in that period when there were the construction of the temples in the land of the hills, Rome, the entity then among those that were persecuted under the hands of the ruler of the period, gaining through the experience, losing in the faults of others, and in the action of others toward the entity. Hence the entity hates the lie, the deceiver, he that would speak one way and act another. The entity then in the name Lysia. In the influences in the present there is felt the love of that tenacious truth that was espoused by the entity in the period, yet ever the fear of those that proclaim their belief or their moral action as not bespeaking the acts of the individual, and the entity rather, than taking the experience of that experience as the guide, that which the entity acts speaks much louder than what one says. In the one before this we find in that period when the land now known as Persia was overrun by the nomads of the desert, the entity then among those that were taken captive by that leader, in the school that was destroyed, and losing their life in the march to the oasis. The entity lost and gained through that experience, learning much of hate for man, or the little dependence that may be put in man, that speaks one way and acts another. Then in the name Adia, in the influences as are seen as personalities, or individuality reflected in personality in the present, that of the love of understanding, yet ever feeling that experience, or applicable experience, is the greater teacher than that of text or only precept, and the love of music, rhythm, and the ability to gain a moral and spiritual lesson from same is held innate and active in the experiences of the entity. In the one before this we find in the land now known as Egypt, the entity then among those who waited upon the priest as was banished in exile during the troublesome period, the entity among those who waited on the holy place from which the ministration of that given as moral, penal, and spiritual precept, that both from the priest and the teacher of that period, the entity lost during the first portion of this experience, setting self up as an ensample, or example, and not keeping it as was claimed as self's life, gaining during the period of reconstruction and the ability to make friends among those who were enemies of the rebellion. The entity then in the name is a holy. The entity's influences may be seen in many of those findings as may be found in the pyramid yet uncovered, for with the waiting on the priest, with the ability of the active agent between the king and the teacher and the minister to the ill, the entity wrought in gold and in fine linen, many of those replicas of the day that may be found, yet, among those of the king's belongings, as well as of many of those that were placed therein, growing, in this period, to be the eldest among those of the period, seeing, then, the invasion, the reconstruction, the rebellion, and the replacing, and the building up, and the experience of the highest civilization as yet, in its broader sense, was experienced by the entity. The innate feelings or experiences being the love of those things orientals pertain to the worship of deity, the dislike of medicines, or that bespeaking of drugs, or that becomes in any way of the nature, yet feeling ever that there must be some awakening from within that enlivens all. In the one before this we find in that land now known as India, the entity then among those that came in from the lowlands to possess the highlands, in the early portion of the gathering of the peoples from the upheavals and the changes in the earth's face, the entity among those that gave to the peoples that of the understanding of the differentiation between the beast and man's indwelling of the high forces of the creative energy, losing in the mice application of that gained, in the name Amal, in that as is seen in the present experience, of doubt, as related to individual activity, in the abilities of the entity in the present experience, these lie in music, and home, and in precept and example. The entity may give much to many in various experiences through these channels, for service to others is the highest service to the creative energy. Knowing, then, that doubt arises from the non-activity of that energy from within, Gain first the understanding of self and keep the precept as is held sacred to self. Ready for questions. Q. How can the body realize to a greater extent this power within? A. There has oft been given, try me, saith the Lord, and knowing that the self is the portion of that creative energy, then act in that manner. Use that thou hast in hand, and the awakening is the result. We are through.